Assalamu alaikum to all of you and Mustafa Tetik. I should say Dr. Mustafa Tetik. Thank you very much for inviting me to this International Congress on Security Studies. I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. And let me share with you, without much ado, one piece of good advice to all of you, and then I will launch into my discussion. The good advice is try to find a copy of my book, Islam and Good Governance, and read it. Thank you. All right, so today my topic is the changing dynamics of the Middle East and US foreign policy. So what I'm going to do is very simple. I will talk about what US national and security interests were in the Middle East prior to now. Let's say until the last 4 or 5 years. And then I will talk about the changes that have happened in the geopolitics and the politics of the Middle East. And then I will talk about how US foreign policy is now adapting to the new Middle East. So these are the 3 steps that I will take. Number 1, talk about the enduring US interests in the Middle East, why the US was involved, and then how the Middle East has changed, and what United States' new foreign policy is. So number 1, the United States has always tried to dominate the Middle East for various reasons. Its number 1 interest has been access to oil and the markets, which means that oil has been one of the most important drivers of modern economy. In fact, some people say that the modern civilization, the energy to the modern civilization comes from oil. And therefore, maintaining access to oil at reasonable prices has always been central for US and Western foreign policies, for that matter, for China and Russia and all major powers like Japan also that consume energy. Access to oil from the Middle East, where it is brought out in the cheapest form, has always been of great interest. But the sale of oil has also generated a lot of disposable income and created wealthy states in the region. And so having access to their markets was also important to Western countries. So for the United States, both having access to oil as well as the oil revenues that were generated has always been critical. So we buy oil at a certain price, then we sell back coke at roughly the same price and get our dollars back. So this has been an enduring and important interest of the United States. The second, and not necessarily the second most important, but the second interest that the United States has in the Middle East is the security of Israel plus. So the United States wants to ensure that the state of Israel is not threatened in any way by any of the players in the Middle East or rest of the world. But what I mean by Israel plus is that the United States in the last 20 years has not only been protecting and guaranteeing the security of Israel, but also protecting and guaranteeing all the policies that the state of Israel has pursued in its territorial expansion, in its marginalization of the Palestinian movements, in its expansion of settlements, and essentially it is its military occupation of West Bank and Gaza. So the United States has, in many ways, even though it has tried to play a peace broker and try to have a lot of rhetoric and some money towards Palestinian rights and well-being, it has essentially treated the security of Israel and Israeli policies as an important interest. It is a bipartisan issue. Both parties tend to work and unite on this particular issue, both the Republicans and the Democrats in the US. The third US interest in the region is security of its allies. And I'm separating that from Israel because there are other allies in the region, but they are not on the same level as Israel, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia. We'll talk about Turkey later, Morocco and Jordan. These are the allies of the United States in the region, and their security, their well-being, and to some extent, even regime protection of these states has been part of US interests. We promote democracy everywhere in the world, but not necessarily in our allies in the Middle East. So another thing that the United States has maintained for a long time has been the exclusion of other powers in the region. So it's like the extension of the Monroe Doctrine to the Middle East. The United States wants to be the sole hegemon of the Middle East. It wants to dominate the region and does not want to share hegemony in the region with any other superpowers, whether it was Soviet Union before the end of the Cold War, now Russia or China, even though those two countries are at the moment beginning to enter the region far more effectively than in the past. So in that sense, the US for a long time has tried to exclude any other major global power from having any significant say in the affairs of the Middle East. And similarly, the United States essentially is trying to prevent the emergence of regional hegemons. So in that sense, the geopolitics is like a two-level game. The United States is playing a global game in the Middle East, where it's keeping global powers out of the Middle East. And then at the next level, it's playing a regional game in the Middle East, where it is seeking to eliminate any emergence of regional powers. If you remember, the dual containment policy of containing both Iraq and Iran was to ensure that there was no regional hegemon in the region. So that is another enduring interest of the US in its policies in the Middle East. Suppression of political Islam, primarily because of political Islam's opposition to Israel, to Western culture, to Western influence in the region. The Islamists, by trying to increase their own legitimacy, they attack the West, rhetorically speaking, and therefore they have made an enemy of the West. The West feels that if political Islam comes to govern all over the Middle East, the West's influence in the region will be reduced. And that was manifest with the Iranian Revolution, the Islamic Revolution of Iran in 1979. A pre-Islamic Iran was a US ally, and Islamic Iran became a US adversary. So learning lessons from this, the West, and especially the United States, has done whatever it could to ensure that political Islam does not come to power in Sunni states in the Middle East. Combating terrorism, especially after 9/11 and the horrendous and dastardly attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the United States for the last 20 years, especially after the collapse of, especially since 2001, has been waging a war against what it sees as a global threat of terrorism, which with the collapse of ISIS in Iraq now, you could say, has diminished. Rhetorically speaking, the US has talked a lot about democracy promotion. I'm very skeptical about whether the US really ever intended to promote democracy. Another interest, which is not often paid attention to, but is a driver, especially when Republicans are in power, is protecting of Christian minorities in Muslim countries in general and in the Middle East too. So these are the enduring interests that the United States have had over the years. But in the past few years, there have been new realities in the Middle East. I will list them and talk a little bit about their implications to the region, and then talk about how US foreign policy is changing. As a result of the United States' two wars, one in Afghanistan and the other in Iraq, we have witnessed the rise of Iran. It is a direct consequence of these two wars and the emergence of what we call as the Shia. To some extent, one could argue that at this moment, one of the most dominant powers in the Middle East is a regional power, and that is Iran. Iran is able to achieve a lot more political outcomes. In fact, it is able to achieve a lot more of their foreign policy goals in the region than even the United States and other countries, whether Saudi Arabia, Egypt, or Turkey. They are not that successful in achieving their regional goals as Iran has been. It has established this connection from Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Yemen. So this entire Shia arc. And if you notice, Saudi Arabia is right in the middle of this arc. So the emergence of the Shia arc is one of the most important geopolitical developments, changing the politics of the region. And you can see its repercussions in many ways. One of the repercussions of the emergence of the Shia power is the rise of geosectarianism. And geosectarianism is essentially this talk of Sunni-Shia conflicts. There have been talks about having a Sunni NATO. At one point, Saudi Arabia was trying to get Turkey and Pakistan to help create a Sunni army. So there is a lot of talk about Sunni unification against the rising Shia power in the Middle East. It takes us back to the days of Mawardi, when he came up with the theory of Khilafah while the Shia tribes are becoming more and more powerful all around Baghdad. The second consequence of the rise of Shia power is that Iran is out and Israel is in, which means that all these Abrahamic Accords that you have witnessed, Arab nations basically abandoning the Palestinian cause and becoming allied with Israel out of fear of Iran. It has completely changed the polarity of the Middle East for over 5-6 decades, since 1948. The Middle East was aligned Arab versus Israel. That was the main polarity, the main contest in the region, the main, shall we say, conflict that shaped the region's politics and its identity. But that has completely changed. Now the Arabs and Israel are kind of aligned against Iran, and all of this is the consequence of that. Another major development that has taken place in the region is the re-entry of Turkey into the Middle East. Turkey, in its secular avatar, was looking more towards Europe. And now in its new avatar, I don't know what you would like to call it, secular, non-secular, Islamist, soft Islamist, I don't know what Turkey is at the moment, but it is more and more, first of all, it's more and more looking like a Middle Eastern country, and it is more and more involved militarily and otherwise in the politics of the Middle East. Now, what all of this has done is that in the Middle East, which is sometimes referred to as the Arab world, it's the non-Arab nations which are the dominant powers. The Ajami nations now dominate the politics of the Middle East and not Arab nations. And the four major powers in the region are Israel, Turkey, Iran, and the powers that are not really involved in dominating the region are the traditional Arab powers like Egypt and Saudi Arabia. So we see the dominance and influence of Ajami nations like Israel, Turkey, and Iran becoming more influential in the Middle Eastern politics. And it's creating a kind of sense of insecurity in the Arab states to such an extent that they have abandoned the Palestinian cause and are bandwagoning with Israel, hoping that Israel will now become the protector of Arab nations against the non-Arab states in the region. Another thing that has happened in the Middle East states is the number of failed states that you see in the region. Syria, Yemen, Iraq is still more of a failed state than an established democracy, Libya. And so it is the failure of good governance in the region, broadly speaking. Even Turkish economy these days is suffering from a very high inflation, and the dollar value is 1:12, I think now. So there is issues of governance. So the governance across the region seems to be very bad. They were protesting in Iran just yesterday. Teachers are protesting for higher wages. So we see that bad governance or ineffective governance is becoming one of the characteristics of this region. And as a result of that, rather than talking about failed nations, we should ask the question, are we looking at a failed region? This is a region in which there are wars. This is a region in which there are civil wars. And this is a region still completely devoid of any serious democracies. With the collapse of Tunisia, there is no Arab democracy anymore. So there is a problem of governance in the region, and it will continue to exacerbate the domestic politics of the countries, the regional politics, and global relations of the nations in that country. It produces now a large number of refugees, which also then put pressure on the relations of the region with the rest of the world. Another interesting thing that has happened in the region of late is, in my opinion, and you can contest it, and that's fine, but I'm convinced and persuaded that we have now witnessed the complete failure of political Islam in the region, especially Sunni political Islam, whether as states, whether as political parties and political movements seeking governance, or as terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah, Hamas, all of this. All of all of these organizations have failed. They have only brought misery wherever they have governed. People suffer in Gaza under Hamas. People have suffered in Saudi Arabia until now. Saudi Arabia seems to be abandoning all the Islamicness, the Wahhabiness of the state. And so one can conclude that at some point, the people in the Middle East should realize that political Islam has failed in all its forms. It is not a major influence at the moment. And finally, it is very clear that the United States is becoming less and less interested in the region, and particularly the current president of the United States, President Biden, region, and even on the issue of the war in Yemen, where the US was so committed on the side of Saudi Arabia, the US under Biden now is less willing to play ball with Saudi Arabia in Yemen. And if you noticed, there have been no major high-level exchanges between the US and Saudi Arabia, unlike when Donald Trump was president. He and his entire family had visited Saudi Arabia. So these are the new changes that are taking place in the Middle East. To just summarize what I see as two things, the new US foreign policy in the Middle East. Number one, President Biden has put an end to the so-called forever wars. Essentially, the US has retrenched from South Asia as well as from Middle East. So there are going to be no surges either in Iraq or Afghanistan, no new force deployment, at least in the long run, which also has implications, which means that the United States is not going to get into a war with Iran over its foreign policy or its nuclear agenda. And that's a key element of the current relations. Number two, the President Biden has repeatedly said that he's reluctant to get involved in the Middle East. What he's basically saying is that his administration is not going to try to resolve the Palestinian problem. So there will be no engagement on the Arab-Israeli issue, the Palestinian state issue under this administration. I'm convinced unless something happens there that forces the US to intervene, there will be no initiative from Washington, at least in this term of President Biden, to address the problem of the Palestinian issue. I think the support for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates has diminished. These two countries were openly friendly with Donald Trump, so I also suspect that on a personal level, the Biden administration is not very happy. And so we are seeing less diplomatic activities with these two countries. At the moment, from Washington, Turkey looks more and more like an adversary and less like an ally. Turkey may not realize it, but its decision to buy the S-400 missiles from Russia has caused a serious dent. We don't expect our allies to essentially ally with our adversaries. And the fact that both India and Turkey have bought S-400s and sanctions have been levied only against Turkey and not against India, even though Turkey is a NATO ally, tells you what this is. I was listening to the Chicago Council on World Affairs, their annual review this year. It's on YouTube. You can go and watch. And some of the experts in that think tank were saying, is there a way to expel nations from NATO? And they were talking about perhaps the time has come to consider expelling Turkey from NATO. And one of the reasons that they were citing was bad governance, decline in democracy, and S-400. Whether your listeners agree with me or not, you can, if you were to plot graphs, there are three graphs that you can see consistently. Number one, Turkey's relations with the West, particularly the US, has been going down. And that parallels Turkish economy, which is also going down. And that also parallels Turkey's democracy, which is also going down. It is not coincidental that these arcs follow each other. The US is going to make a fundamental shift in its grand strategy. That is my expectation. According to Professor John Mearsheimer, there are four broad categories, grand strategies that the US could pursue, generally speaking. Number one is global domination, that we try to dominate every part of the world. The second one is the opposite of that, that is isolationism. Global domination requires us to fight battles all over the world, spend tons and tons. We would probably have to spend close to 10% of our GDP on defense if we wanted to dominate the entire planet. And the opposite of that is isolationism, which would help us reduce our defense spending to maybe 2%, and become a fort and not be involved in global affairs to such an extent. And thanks to God and geography, the United States is a pretty good fort. We have two oceans that protect us from external invasions. They are like moats to a fort, and they are really deep and very wide. So invading the United States at the moment, there is no power on earth that has the capabilities to launch. So isolationism, which we did practice in the 1930s between the two wars, is a possibility, but I don't think that the United States will ever return to isolationism. So these are the two possible grand strategies. In between, you have two others. One is selective engagement, that we selectively engage regions that are of vital and critical interest to us, like the Middle East. So at the moment, the United States until now has been involved in trying to establish hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, starting with the Monroe Doctrine, which we pretty much dominate Europe, and pushing eastwards and pushing NATO eastwards. The third region that we like to dominate is where we are competing with China is East Asia and Middle East and North America. The US is not that engaged in Central Asia and Africa. So you could argue that in the last 20 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, US has been following the grand strategy of selective engagement and domination. But I think the United States is going to move to what defensive realists call as offshore balancing. And that is probably what the US is going to do in the Middle East, which means that the US will not want to dominate the Middle East anymore. The only thing that the US will pursue is offshore balancing, which means it will prevent any outside state or any regional state from becoming hegemon in that region, except if that potential player is Israel. So if Israel tries to become a hegemonic player in the Middle East and dominates, the US is okay with that. But if any other regional player, whether it is Iran or Turkey, Saudi Arabia or Egypt, is singularly seeking to dominate the region, the US will either balance it directly or help other contestants and raise their capacity to balance that so that there is no single player that dominates the region. And that would be comfortable for the US in the long term. So I have a feeling that that is what Biden and maybe even the next president will pursue, a strategy of offshore balancing in the Middle East. My final recommendation to the United States is to indeed do that, because at the moment, the United States democracy is in decline. Even though our economy is doing pretty well, we still have areas of social inequality, economic inequality, which need to be addressed. So the United States needs to recoup, rebuild, and rethink what its engagement is going to be in a world in which we have a very serious challenger like China, which is going to be far more formidable, both economically, politically, and militarily than the Soviet Union ever was. So with these comments, I will be happy to listen to your responses and also engage with any questions or comments that anybody has.